Imagine yourself living in a world that is mostly silent. No talking, just you and your thoughts and your own spiritual wanderings. While most of us would consider such a life crippling, weakening, unbearable, this is the kind of life that Thomas Merton and multiple other monks from St. Benedict's order chose to live. And it was from this silence that Thomas Merton in particular screamed from behind as he wrote poetry and books, especially about the ideas of contemplation, hospitality, and even civil rights. Not just ideas, but revolutionary ideas. Merton was a 21st century Trappist monk. He served at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Trappist, Kentucky at the end of his life. And he used the power of his rhetoric and of his writing to share with the world bold ideas and made bold statements concerning events that were happening in the 60s and in the 70s. I've always been struck by Merton's ability to transcend time with his very ancient faith in a very modern world, and the way that he wrote and the power that he used the pen. It was once said that the pen is mightier than the sword, and if anybody exemplified that, it was certainly Merton. And so, this afternoon, what I want to do is I want to share with you Merton's thoughts in particular about contemplation, hospitality, and the thoughts that he had concerning civil rights. Thomas Merton introduced the concept of the contemplative lifestyle to the modern world in a way that had never been done before. For centuries, contemplation was an idea that had been viewed as an ascetic practice relegated only to the monastics and to the monks and to the Catholic Church. What Merton did is he took that concept and he made it something that's very understandable, something that in the modern world, in the 60s no less, something that the modern general public could grasp and something that they could hold up as an ideology. And the way he did this, he wrote a book called Seeds of Contemplation. And the book Seeds of Contemplation would be revised several times, 7 times actually. And the 7th revision, they actually changed the name of it to New Seeds of Contemplation. And that particular book became considered by many to be a modern masterpiece. Some of you may be wondering right now, what is contemplation? What does it mean? What is it about? And I think that we should probably let Merton answer that for himself, as he does in that book, New Seeds of Contemplation. Merton writes, "Contemplation is the highest expression of man's intellectual and spiritual life. It is that life itself, fully awake, fully active, and fully aware, that is alive. It is spiritual wonder. It is spontaneous awe at the sacredness of life, of being. It is gratitude for life, for awareness, and for being. It is a vivid realization of the fact that life and being in us proceed from an invisible, transcendent, and infinitely abundant source. Contemplation is above all awareness of the reality of that source," which for Merton was the Creator God. This introduction of contemplation took it from being some ancient monastic practice or some discipline for the spiritually elite. It took it from that type of thought and it moved it into the modern world, and it told the modern person that they themselves can live sacramentally, that they can live in such a way that they see the sacredness in everything that they do. Merton's desire for contemplation, Merton's desire to be a contemplative as a lifestyle, is what actually caused him to serve and eventually join the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky, which is a contemplative colony. And while he was at the Abbey of Gethsemane, he entered as a contemplative, but there was another aspect of the Abbey that really made an impact on his life, and that was the discipline of hospitality. And the discipline of hospitality was actually something rooted in the Benedictine thought from St. Benedict. And St. Benedict said this about hospitality. He said that the guest represents Christ and has a claim on the welcome and the care of the community. And so while Merton was at the Abbey, hospitality became part of the heart of his service as a monk. It became a very important part of his life. The interesting thing is, when Merton entered the Abbey, he entered it as a way to get away from the world. It was something that he saw as an opportunity for him to be in solitude. In fact, in his book, his autobiography, The Seven Mountain Story, in that Thomas Merton makes this quote when he was talking about the being led into the Abbey and the gate closing behind him. He said, "I am now enclosed in the four walls of my new freedom." So Thomas Merton saw solitude as freedom when he entered in. Paul Pierson, a couple of decades later, actually made comment in a journal article about Thomas Merton that Thomas Merton spent his time in solitude, but eventually moved into a place where hospitality was welcome. Pierson makes this comment. He says, "The openness and hospitality we see in Merton's later years has its deep roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition and was certainly not something totally new when St. Benedict enshrined it in his monastic rule. It is central to the Jewish and Christian scriptures and to deserve spirituality. Openness to the stranger runs throughout the Bible, whether we think of Abraham under the terebinths at Mamre, the expectant mother who could find no room in the inn, or the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Merton gave us ways in the modern world to grasp and employ the sacred discipline of hospitality," just like he did with the other disciplines. Pierson also commented on Merton's thought, "Welcoming the stranger can be a source of blessing to us as it was to Thomas Merton. The childhood warning to not talk to strangers seems to follow many of us throughout life. We learn to do many of the things we were warned about as a child, like using knives properly, driving a car, drinking a gin and tonic. But we find it much harder to overcome our fear of strangers and to be open to the gifts they bring us, including, as St. Benedict tells us, strangers actually have the ability to bring us the gift of God's mercy." So Thomas Merton was a modern man with an ancient faith. And in the 60s, he used that ancient faith to rail against some of the racial injustices that he saw during the Civil Rights Movement. Merton continued to use the power of the pen, and from behind his silence, that is how he screamed to the world. Racial tension was first brought to his eyes in his service at a house in poverty-stricken Harlem in 1941 known as the Friendship House. Baroness Catherine DeWeck actually ran the house, and Merton was so struck and impressed with her work that he actually almost decided not to join the Abbey as a monk, and he was going to stay in Harlem and work full-time in this house taking care of poverty-stricken blacks in Harlem. But not only was he impressed with Catherine DeWitt's work at the house, he was even more aware of how the white people around poverty-stricken Harlem were silent as to the poverty that was right in front of their face. And so he did eventually go on to join the Abbey, but from the Abbey he actually continued to write and rail against civil rights. In fact, he wrote 3 letters. Now catch the title of these letters. He wrote 3 letters that were eventually published in journals, and they were called Letters to a White Liberal. And in these letters he railed against the fact that even the liberals weren't doing anything to really change the civil rights issues that were in the nation at the time. Needless to say, his letters were not well received by the general public, but Merton continued on, and he continued to write them. It was said of Merton that Merton's solitude led him to find God, and in finding God, it led him to find God's people. So he moved from being a contemplative in solitude to actually being someone who embraced the world in many facets. Thomas Merton was indeed a modern man with an ancient faith. To this day, his written works and his work at the Abbey of Gethsemane have left an indelible mark on 21st century philosophy as well as Christianity. His work challenged the status quo. It challenged the issues of the society, and particularly his modern approaches brought the ideas of contemplation, hospitality, and even social justice into the forefront of a modern society. Thomas Merton has changed the world, and he serves as a beacon to us all to change and to grow and to see the sacredness all around us. Applause. Get a picture of everyone's beautiful face. Okay, you don't have to like